We'll take a look at big ideas that'll translate to even the smallest of spaces right after this. Over the past 20 years as a garden designer, I've enjoyed helping homeowners create private sanctuaries full of beauty and wonder. I find each garden to be a fresh opportunity to explore ways to create uniquely personal spaces. These are just a few of the gardens I've helped to transform into garden homes. Hi, I'm Alan Smith. Welcome to The Garden Home, a show about garden design principles that help inspire us to blur the lines between indoors and outdoors. Now in today's show, we're going to take a look at urban gardens. Now these are gardens designed for the public. They're gardens that encourage us to step into and embrace the beauty of nature, at the same time having a fast-paced city life just around the corner. First stop will be Chicago, where we'll visit with a well-known landscape architect about these amazing planters along a busy shopping area known as the Magnificent Mile. While we're in the Windy City, we'll visit City Hall. What a view! The mayor will show us his innovative rooftop garden and tell us about some of the city's green initiatives. Next stop will be the New York Botanical Garden. It's only a few miles from the hustle and bustle of New York City, which is all decked out for the holidays. I can't wait to take you there. And I'll show you some examples of gardens I've designed, like this healing garden at a hospital. We have a lot of ground to cover in today's show, so let's get started. Let's step into my design studio, where I can share some drawings and projects with you that I've been working on over the past few years. And then I'll take us to our first destination. As you can imagine, creating public spaces can have its own set of challenges. What you come up with in the way of ideas that work in theory or on drawings doesn't always translate into the landscape. And once you get something laid out, well, often you have to change it in midstream. You have to modify the idea to fit reality. I spoke with landscape architect Douglas Hare in Chicago about his planters that lend beauty to a stretch of the city known as the Magnificent Mile. Doug explained that when he first came up with the planters, he had to make some adjustments, but now the abundant containers have become hallmarks to this part of town. Tell me a little bit about what's going on Michigan Avenue.
Michigan Avenue, it's a pet project of ours. Well, Michigan Avenue started about 1993, and it goes for over 33 blocks down the center of Michigan Avenue and down the median strips. That is just essentially a horticultural display in the most urban of areas. And it really was a public-private partnership between the city of Chicago and a group of businessmen and merchants who wanted to do something to improve the streetscape on Michigan Avenue, which is Chicago's premier shopping street. We promoted, along with the streetscape members, the idea of using this seasonal rotation, of using bulbs and annuals and perennials and then the cool season crop.
So it works extremely well. It's very festive. What was your inspiration for the idea to take this natural approach?
Well, I appreciate a naturalistic style. Obviously, we work with formal style. As a landscape architect, you have to work with many styles because you have many types of clients. But my natural inclination, having grown up on the farm in a rural setting, is the naturalistic style. And I guess that isn't necessarily native, but it evokes what happens in nature. I think that Michigan Avenue is really a survival. In other words, if I would have gone with a monoculture of blocks of all this and all that, and in some parts of Michigan we only get 3 hours of sun a day, and sun bounces off the skyscrapers, and so you don't really know your microclimate there. 20 foot away, one bed might get a lot more sun than another.
Right.
So I thought that by going with what I call a casserole planting, I put everything in there, and it's designed in a way, with color choice and texture, and it's a harmonious sort of plant palette that it reaches its own equilibrium, and if a plant doesn't do well, something else overtakes it. And so it allows you to have, over that series of 30, 40 blocks, these series of microclimates, it allows certain plants to thrive and take over, so it's sort of...
Yes, they respond to those specific conditions.
And some people might say that's cheating. Landscape and gardening is about having fun, and it's about using plants to have fun.
Not far from the Magnificent Mile in Chicago is an interesting garden located high above the city street and just below some of the city's towering skyscrapers. It's a rooftop garden at City Hall, and Bill Abel tells us a little about it.
We've got so many black tar roofs in cities and so many asphalt surfaces that we made cities hotter. By making them hotter, we've also increased air pollution. Mayor Daley has really kind of rolled up his sleeves and tried to figure out how local cities can do something about that air quality problem at the same time they beautify the city. So City Hall roof is his idea and one of a number of projects going on throughout the city of Chicago to reduce what's called the urban heat island. That means that cities are too dark, too hot. They create these heat islands, and by planting things, by using more light colors, you can actually reduce temperatures and increase comfort and improve the environment in cities. By putting this rooftop garden on top of the roof, we'll be able to cut energy costs in City Hall, both cooling in the summer and heating in the winter, by over $4,000 a year. And we're going to be able to make this roof last at least twice as long because the soil on top of it protects the underlying roof.
Absolutely, and all of the tenants around here will be able to enjoy this patch of green.
Yeah, it's amazing. You've got entire neighborhoods or cities up there looking down on roofs throughout the city, and it's really a great place to create some green space.
Tell me about the inspiration for this idea. How'd this come about?
Mayor Daley was the reason we're doing this. He went to Europe. We have an active sister cities program, and he came back from Hamburg, having found out that it is common practice throughout Europe to have roof gardens, and in fact to have roof gardens as parts of municipal building and zoning codes.
I saw Hamburg, and they had a number of buildings and had some wild grass, and overhanging. I said, gee, that's a great idea. We have a lot of flat roofs in Chicago. So I came back and I said, here, and let's start looking at this. And I love gardening in Chicago, where flowers, trees, fountains, all that, making part of Chicago's life, the environment. I said, what wasted space we have up here?
I'm knocked out by so much of what I see here in Chicago, from the Botanic Garden, it's a world-class facility, to the plantings down on Michigan Avenue.
Yeah, when I first started that, people were opposed to me. They said, oh, you're going to change the tenor of the street. Merchants were concerned and all that, and all of a sudden now you see more and more people saying, hey, I'm going to do it in front of my business. I'm going to, it's like a fever catching on. As you look at the beautiful landscape of Chicago, you don't realize when you're downtown all these flat roofs and what it can be, and that's why
a lot of square footage.
Right, and you think about what effect it has on global warming and air quality. Right here in a city like ours, to me, that is my goal: is to have all these real estate people understand that you can affect the environment on your roof as much as inside your building.
While we're on the subject of urban gardens, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the New York Botanical Garden, located just miles from the heart of the Big Apple. Now, I visited this garden during the winter, and I have to say it was incredibly beautiful. The glass house contained the annual train exhibit by renowned artist Paul Bussey, complete with miniature New York landmarks, all made from natural materials. During the winter, the grounds of the Botanical Garden revealed their strong architectural elements, and the trees and shrubs showed off their evergreen coats and bright berries.
The Enid A. Hopkins Conservatory is the largest Victorian glass house in America. It's an acre of plants under glass. It's an eco-tour around the world.
And of course, it's housing your Christmas or holiday extravaganza this year.
The Holiday Garden Train Show, yes, is right inside. A lovely collection of historic houses, replicas of some of the great landmarks of New York City. We started with 15, now we're up to well over 90. And they're all made out of plant materials. Seed pods and twigs and leaves and palm fronds and barks. All of these replicas, from the Brooklyn Bridge to the Metropolitan Museum of Art to the Guggenheim Museum, are all made out of natural materials. This year the Guggenheim is made out of fungi. The train show does bring lots of youngsters. I'm sure they clamor to come here because many of them keep coming back year after year with their families. Some people even come several times during the same season.
While we were in New York, we couldn't help but check out the sights and sounds of the city. It's amazing to see so many people outdoors enjoying the cool, crisp winter air. I love how the storefronts are decorated to delight visitors and shoppers. A video postcard from New York City shows us Radio City Music Hall, the Empire State Building, this breathtaking skyline, the Chrysler Building, Tiffany's, the Plaza Hotel, Trump Tower, Times Square, Broadway, and so much more. Whenever I think about designing a garden, I always fall back on 12 basic principles. They've always held me in good stead over the years. Now, when I want to establish a sense of privacy in a space, two of those principles come to the forefront. That's framing the view and enclosure. Now, it's easy to see how these rules would apply to a private garden home, but it might be more difficult to apply them to a public space, even though I think it's equally important for them to create a sense of privacy when appropriate. Let's go back to New York for a moment. Central Park was designed by one of my heroes, Frederick Law Olmsted. You see, Olmsted is considered the father of American landscape architecture, and a hallmark of his designs are large landscapes that look natural but are primarily man-made. In Central Park, Olmsted planted trees and placed stones into the scenery to create these ideal settings. But one thing that stands out to anyone who visits Central Park is how private you feel in such a public and busy place. There's so many wonderful vistas to get caught up in Central Park, and so many beautiful places for people of all ages to enjoy. You have to believe that Frederick Law Olmsted would be very proud of what he did for New York City. Now, I've taken this idea of creating privacy in a public place and applied it to a design I did for a hospital garden. Let's take a look. Now, this is the Healing Garden at Baptist Hospital in Little Rock, Arkansas. We wanted to make an outdoor room that would give people an opportunity to break away from the stress of the hospital. It's a place where, among the busyness of life, we can slow down. Family members can come out to pray or meditate. Physicians, nurses, and hospital staff can take a break among the beauty of nature. Newly released patients can come out of the hospital and be refreshed by what they see. In other words, it's a place to help heal the mind, body, and spirit, hence the name, a healing garden. One of the ways we established privacy in this space was to create a long hallway from one end of the garden to a statue. As you walk toward this focal point, you begin to forget there are passing cars and people just a few yards away. A second focal point, across this time, is located just beyond, pulling you further into the garden. Now, another way we created privacy is with enclosure. Low hedges surround the garden, as do containers of seasonal plants. These containers also create a sense of rhythm along the paths. You'll also notice I planned plenty of seating in this space so that it would encourage people to come out into the garden and spend time. You know, I gain inspiration for my designs from a variety of places. Nature herself can be an infinite source of ideas. Certainly visiting great gardens is a way to gather ideas for new designs. And of course, there's history. I love to look at old plans from the 17th and 18th centuries. Take, for instance, this one of a house called Belton in Lincolnshire, England. It was designed by a fellow by the name of Colin Campbell, a Scottish architect and draftsman. You can see that it's a very elaborate plan with all sorts of parterres and walks and alleys, reflective of the 17th and early 18th centuries. Now let's take a look at containers for just a moment. While containers don't necessarily enclose an area completely, they can imply a sense of enclosure. And this is a great idea for anyone who wants to establish the feeling of enclosure without blocking their garden off completely from their neighbors. When you go about selecting plants for containers, keep this in mind. Start with a tall, spiky plant to give the arrangement some height. Plants like cordyline or some of the salvias or ornamental grasses. Next, fill in around the middle with round and full plants to give the composition a robust look. In the fall, I enjoy using mums like these from the European Prophet series, or in the summer, geraniums like the Tango series. Isn't this lavender pink color nice? Lastly, you need to choose plants that will cascade over the edge of the container, like ivies or sweet potato vines. Keeping these shapes in mind will help you come up with interesting containers during your next visit to the garden center or nursery. Now, just for inspiration, let me share with you a composition I came up with using that simple container recipe. Here you can see I used a tall and spiky purple fountain grass, Pennisetum rubrum. In the middle, two lantanas, this one called Carlos, and the other Patriot Hot Country. There's also a coleus from the stained glass work series called Swiss Sunshine. Now, adding a touch of drama to the composition is this ivy geranium called Melina, Helichrysum Limelight, and Petunia Ramblin' Peach Glow. I know how much time I spend on garden design projects, and I certainly know how much time I've put in my own garden home. So it just makes sense that when you put so much effort and energy into a property, that you protect it. Protecting your garden home investment falls under a couple of headings. The first is protecting the hard work that goes into your garden. No one wants children, pets, or even neighbors trotting through your flower beds, creating what I call a cow path. Now, the second area of protection is all about safety. Plantings that can make your home less of a target for break-ins. This would include plants like barberry with its sharp thorns, or hollies and quince. Planting these under a window would certainly be a deterrent to criminals looking for an easy opportunity to break in. If you're thinking about planting some of those shrubs in your garden, you might want to keep this in mind. Planting shrubs in the fall or early spring while they're dormant or still asleep is ideal. Getting them in the ground so their roots can become established well before the summer heat rolls in will put your plants in good stead. Now, planting shrubs is really simple if you follow a few basic principles. First, dig a hole that's at least twice the size of the root ball. Then mix the soil from the hole with some compost, peat moss, or well-rotted manure. You see, I like to use 1 part soil from the hole with 1 part bagged cow manure. Before planting, make sure the plant isn't root-bound in the container. I like to tear the roots just a little bit to help them get started in their new environment. Then place the plant in the hole. Just make sure that the top of the root ball is slightly higher than the hole, say by an inch or so. This will allow for settling. Shrubs like azaleas are particularly sensitive to being planted too deeply, so be careful. Now all I have to do is fill in with the soil mix and water as I go. You see, this will displace any air pockets around the root ball. To finish, I feed them with an all-purpose liquid fertilizer and tuck them in with about 3 inches of mulch to help conserve moisture and keep those weeds down. In today's show, we focused a lot on this idea of urban gardens, these large, expansive areas where the public is invited to go out and enjoy a bit of nature. Now let's take a look at some of the ideas we've seen in these properties and bring them home to our own garden homes. Now, no matter the size of the space, you always want to feel connected in some way. One way I like to achieve this is by creating a series of small, intimate spaces around the home. In my home, I've divided the garden into many areas. There's the front garden, the fountain garden, the rondelle, the vegetable garden, the shade garden, not to mention the loggia and the service yard. Another important aspect of designing public gardens is this idea, despite their vast size, of creating a sense that they're on a human scale, using techniques that make them feel intimate and more comfortable. In home gardens, you can do this by building fences, either man-made or natural, like this holly hedge, or even by screening out the views of neighboring houses, like in this penthouse in Chicago. The plantings along the balustrade give this space a sense of enclosure, even though no fence has been built to completely screen out the other buildings. I even use this concept in a small condo garden by building planter boxes along the deck to shield an outdoor living area from a busy golf course beyond. Now, the containers I used are wooden, but any container will work. Here are some tips to keep in mind. I've designed these large wooden planter boxes for this deck. Now, you don't have to have anything this big. You just want to make sure that the container is large enough to hold plenty of soil. You see, plants will always struggle and dry out if there's less soil than they need. Wooden boxes can be beautiful, whether you paint them or let them weather like we're going to with these, but they can have a tendency to rot. That's why we're lining the insides of these with a plastic waterproofing liner that can be formed to the shape of the inside of the container. Good drainage is critical in container gardening, so we've elevated the boxes with a few 2x2 boards attached to the bottom. When it comes to container gardening, or any other form of gardening for that matter, the soil is the key to success. And it may even be more important here because you see your plants are almost on little islands. They're isolated. They're at your mercy. Their roots can't penetrate deep into the ground. It just makes sense that the larger the container you use, the more at home your plants will feel. The more soil that's in there, the more moisture it will retain, and that'll cut down on the amount of watering you have to do. When it comes to soil for containers, you don't want to fall into the trap of thinking you can just go in the backyard and dig up some soil. You see, this is generally heavy and it doesn't drain well. I prefer to use pre-blended mixes in bags. These are easier to work with, and there's no weed seed in them. These blends are designed to be lighter. You see, the coarse organic material and perlite and vermiculite create air spaces, and peat moss and other forms of humus help retain moisture. Now, this is just about ready for planting. When you garden in containers, you'll discover that you have to be a little more attentive to feeding. You see, frequent watering will flush out many of the nutrients. That's why I like to have plenty of liquid fertilizer on hand. It only took a few years for these planters to fill out and give the deck the privacy the homeowners desired. Now, this condo is in California, so we were able to use a lot of Mediterranean plants, such as rosemary, along with annuals that look good from early spring to late fall. Another consideration for these planters was incorporating deer-resistant plants, like lavender. If you have problems with deer in your garden, you might consider planting artemisia, dill, mint, Russian sage, larkspur, and even daffodils. Most public gardens are designed on a vast scale, certainly when you compare them to our own home gardens, and they're meant to accommodate large crowds of people, so it's important that they're directed through the space in a way that makes their experience enjoyable. Paths, of course, are key to this, just as they are in our private gardens. But another trick that you'll often see is the use of focal points to help draw the visitor through the different garden spaces, to point them in the right direction, so to speak. Probably the best example of a focal point I've ever seen is in a large private garden in England that's open to the public. Over the years, I've had many opportunities to while away the hours in this beautiful garden. Welcome to Chatsworth in England, home to the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire since 1549, and an inspirational playground for gardeners of all ages. Focal points are important to gardens of all sizes, but I found several dramatic and inspiring uses of focal points at Chatsworth that are just too good to pass up. Take, for example, Blanche's urn. As you start down the shady path, you see its silhouette high on the hill. The image is intriguing, and before you know it, you've started down a path towards it. As you approach, the first thing you notice is its scale. It's colossal. Below, it didn't look quite this large, but up close, it's enormous. Scale is another important aspect of garden design to keep in mind. You see, if Blanche's urn had only been a few feet high, not only would it have been underwhelming for the space, but chances are it wouldn't have caught your eye from half a mile away. To draw visitors through your garden, try placing focal points throughout. Containers are an easy example. For instance, in my front garden, I've placed a low urn at one end. In my fountain garden, you're drawn to the water feature in the center, as well as to this large variegated agave. Structures can also serve as focal points. Looking through the framed view of these twin arbors, the tool shed becomes a focal point. Focal points can be objects that you place in the garden, like sculpture. Not too long ago, I visited a garden where a kinetic sculpture caught my attention and drew me out into the garden for a closer look. I hope you've enjoyed seeing some of the urban and public gardens we featured in today's show. Doug Hare's landscaping along the Magnificent Mile in Chicago, the New York Botanical Garden, the healing garden I created, as well as Chatsworth. I hope you come away with some ideas on giving your garden home some privacy, intimacy, and focus. Until next time, from the Garden Home, I'm Alan Smith. More information about today's topic and other topics covered in this series can be found at pallansmith.com.
On an upcoming episode of P. Allen Smith's Garden Home.
Are you ready to explore a little mystery in the garden? We'll learn about grottos, moss gardens, blue springs, plus what schizophragma hydrogenoides and bloodroot are. It's a show that'll have you on the edge of your seat. I'll see you then.